Thank you. It feels like coming home again to my hometown. I'm the one as to why this is called the TEDxAmoskeag Millyard. I'm the one that's going to talk about the Amoskeag Millyard, but not right now. I'm going to first take you around the world to something that's been in the newspapers. And these are not my photographs. I've not been to Bangladesh. But I want you to just consider one thing. Is this a bad man? The building collapsed and killed 1,200 people, or just short of 1,200 people. But what I did is I searched and searched and searched the internet for pictures of the building prior to its collapse. And I then used a technique I developed from the work of Piranesi, a quarter millennium ago, artist in Italy, to reconstruct what the facade looked like. I wanted to know, what is the architecture of this building? And would somebody who thinks this is a good-looking building put up your hand? And I'll ask Felix to interview you to see whether your evolutionary precursor is the same as the chimpanzee for the rest of us, because it's ugly. And not only that, I learned something important about it that's not in the newspapers, which is that he built a cantilever to make even more space. There's 3 illegal floors on top of a 5-story building that was built for a retail center, not a factory. But when you build a cantilever, the front columns of this building are sustaining 7 times the load as if they had just simply built the wall upwards. He didn't know. I'm sure he didn't have intentions to be in prison the rest of his life for essentially the manslaughter of almost 1,200 people. So there is something going on here that I think is larger than whether or not this was a bad man. And that is what I want to talk about. And before you think about, well, this is Bangladesh, things are bad in Bangladesh. But here in the United States, these kinds of things don't happen like this. Consider that in 1860 they did in Lawrence, Massachusetts, with the collapse of the Pemberton Mill, on just killing 600 people. I'm not really focusing for a moment just on the manslaughter of people from the failure of mills. I want to show you why that mill collapsed in Lawrence. It was the miscasting, the industrial product of cast iron columns. And from that date forward, they picked a more high-tech material, a material still in use today, a more advanced high-tech material for building construction of factories than cast iron timber. Almost every single factory that was constructed after that date, including the ones down here in the Millyard, were constructed with timber columns. The first factories in the Millyard were constructed with cast iron. The Cott Bottling Company building was the print works, and that had cast iron columns, and they didn't collapse. But I want to now take you back home to Manchester, but to the Manchester that almost very few of you in the audience ever saw. The Manchester that brought me to this city, the Amoskeag Millyard. My parents driving me by it to go skiing on the weekends, I saw this before the trees have now grown up to block that view. But that view is no longer there. This view is no longer there. It is a Manchester that when I crossed the river to look at this, I said, wow, this is it. The extraordinary nature of an urban design that was crafted. This is not Rana Plaza. This is not something that is thoughtlessly designed. And it is not the work of a single architect. It is a work of craftsmanship. The entrepreneurs that own this were in Boston. The people who built it were here in Manchester. Ezekiel Straw and everybody else who worked in the first phases of building a new town, a model town that stretched along the riverbank, where they crafted not buildings that weren't themselves works of architecture of note, but the complex emerged over a 50-year period into one of the most extraordinary examples of urban design that was destroyed by urban renewal in the 60s. One by one down. The canals are gone, all in the name of the motor car. And so when we consider this urban design and what has happened in our country, not just in Bangladesh, in the encounter with the modern world and our forgetting the kind of craftsmanship that is really needed to build a city environment. And this kind of thing, even on the river facade, when you look at this, how it rises to where it goes around the corner, is it accidental or is it design? But this is the design that followed in our time, the destruction of that. And really trying to understand what it was, I think, is really important, because as we consider how we go forward in the city and in the country as a whole, we have to understand this. And for this, I just wanted to show you a series of pictures of the difference. The canals, now this, the same view today. And we have a nearby example of what could have been. In fact, this work, publicity, I was an advocate, and my first phase of life was as a journalist to make this known. I was too late. But then my work helped to influence the creation of a national park in Lowell. And see how beautiful it is. But that was one small piece. This was a whole city. And this is the first article that I ever wrote in a national publication, as it turned out. Who would have ever guessed? But I want to just have you consider that particular view and what happened to it. And the name on the article, I want you to consider: must we destroy our past in order to renew our cities? Well, that was the mantra of urban renewal that time. They brought people from New York who were interested in building roads and parking, and the individual plants in the Millyard at that time, they all wanted parking. Well, of course. But is this something that now I think many of you would say, oh, what it could have been? It could have been a World Heritage Site. I know that because I'm on the World Heritage organization, ICOMOS. This is the model that was shaping the city of Manchester and almost every other city in this country. And now I take you halfway back around the world to Srinagar, India, Kashmir. This now somewhat forgotten, the civil strife that's going on there. And I found Mar Road. Well, I mean, okay, they built a new road through the city, but what was it there before? A canal, a transportation canal, not a power canal. I found these in the British Library to see what this extraordinary magic landscape was of a pre-industrial, not an industrial, a pre-industrial world that then ended up looking like this because of the model of the motor car and the influence of the United States and the West and Europe, where this was future and that was past. So this is the one canal that was left that I could actually barge down and see. And I think it's worth just looking at this and seeing the billboard that was nearby in the town and see the image that this cement company puts on as to what is the modern city. It's not there. It's not them. It's not the world that these people were living in and growing up, but that was coming. And that's the kind of image, and much of Srinagar began to erode. And in the 30 years since I took this picture, and even in the year I shot this picture, it had already started, because look at the difference. And so I got involved in the structure of these buildings because I wanted to rehabilitate in people's minds what this ancient construction was, so people would understand that it's not insubstantial. And I then learned by moving to California about the earthquake issue. In 1888, these are the buildings that survived. The palace that was built out of stone collapsed. But I want you to see a change that took place even before I ever got there in Kathmandu. And just look at, for a moment, take note of that particular building as I do the change of slide. And watch city from 1920 to 1980, a transformation. And think of how many times you've considered going to Kathmandu or having been to Kathmandu to look at the World Heritage sites that are there. But it is not there as an integral whole anymore, because here is the World Heritage Site, but 100 paces from it is that I photographed ongoing as a construction project. So right in the heart of Patan Center and out in the agricultural fields where no building should be. You see that? So who's minding the store even in a World Heritage Site? And then earthquake. So what's going on here? This is the modern construction that everybody thinks is stronger. And in India, they call it a puka building. A strong building, it's a concrete building. And a kacha building is one built of timber and mud and brick and whatever. And I entitled a lecture I gave at the World Bank, Kacha is puka, puka is kacha, because it's the kacha buildings that survive. And I've seen it now over and again in the 20 years I studied this subject. And the reason is that these are still hand-built buildings, one by one. A sack of cement, that's not an industrial process when the system requires a level of precision of construction that the people are not sustaining, and the buildings collapse. As you see here, even a relatively small building next to a kacha building here in Turkey, a traditional building, half timber. I've even now proposed, and I'm looking for students of engineering to actually prove this because I'm convinced of it, that armature cross walls, the idea of taking this ancient technology and using it to keep the concrete buildings from collapsing. And you go to Haiti. Haiti, 300,000 people are believed to have been killed, 250,000 people killed in the earthquake, when this is a picture shot after the earthquake. It looks like that. I stayed in an unreinforced masonry building in a hotel 3.5 stories high that never closed. Just blocks, walking distance from the National Palace. And this is the building across the street from that one, collapsed. And this is the National Palace. And then this is the cathedral. Well, why did these collapse? They are, in fact, reinforced concrete, very early reinforced concrete. That's the rebar after it's rusted. And so compare that to ancient Rome, where this was built 2,000 years ago. And this is the photographs I took of it. 1/4 millennium passed between the fact that Piranesi drew it in the 1750s and I photographed it in 2002, and it looks the same, and it didn't even have a roof membrane on it. And that's concrete, but not reinforced concrete. It's the steel that, in fact, takes these buildings away. And then consider what you've read about in the newspaper, that, in fact, they're planning almost the equivalent to the population of the United States. If not now, where it's about 300 million, but when I was growing up, being relocated from the country to the city by forced relocation, becoming consumers rather than producers into buildings like these, all of which have steel rebar, all of which are this form of construction, none of which speak the language of these people, speak the national style, are part of the culture. And I want to then take you to Pakistan, where in fact I had the tiniest little influence, but it has grown into a bit of a movement. 80,000 people died in this earthquake in concrete and stone masonry buildings, rubble stone. And the traditional construction of the area that had been forgotten was, in fact, what I showed you there in Turkey and it was a timber-laced masonry, only this, the walls are only this thick, but there it is after the earthquake. Killed 80,000 people. So the local people, before the government would even allow it, it had given them any assistance, started building in this construction next to the rubble stone buildings that had fallen down. And 2 weeks after I gave a lecture in Islamabad to the engineering team for the Pakistan government, hosted by UN Habitat, they approved this form of construction, and then they were giving assistance to it, and 250,000 new houses have been constructed of traditional construction after this earthquake in the northern Pakistan area. And the same colleagues of mine, architects from Ireland and from Switzerland, are now working in Haiti, furthering the same kind of approach to design in the Haitian context. Where did this come from? From my learning about the construction of mills. Why? Masonry buildings? Okay. They're unreinforced? Okay. But for the Americans to build buildings in the United States was timber floors and put the looms on the 3rd and 4th floor. They had to come up with a system. That is bolting the walls to the floors, and the floors having membranes of slow-burning construction as a single cross-laminated membrane, and the bolts on the outside of the building. In England and in Europe, the mills were out of masonry. They would collapse if you put the looms in the mill itself. All the looms had to be in a weave shed. Not here. Timber and masonry. Well, they reinvented this construction for earthquake-resistant construction that is in the California Building Code, and it came from Manchester. It was invented in the early 19th century in Manchester, and so I wanted you to consider where we are. The city has been destroyed to a large extent, but if the canal buildings are not still there, the canals still are. And are you going to wait until archaeologists 2,000 years from now dig them up, or begin the work to bring back the canals as part of urban design and the future of the city? And if the men can't bring this about, maybe the girls can, as we learned earlier. Thank you very much.